This is devotional is for Sunday, January the 22nd, 2023. Now the title, Ever Wonder Where is Justice? Now scripture reading is one chapter, Job chapter 24. Well, Eliphaz, the third of Job's friends, to argue that Job's troubles were like those of the wicked, evoked a response from Job that began in chapter 23 and continued into today's study, Job chapter 24. Now, Eliphaz, having slandered Job's character, accused him of some great evil and urged him to repent, and promising that God would restore him. But nevertheless, though he suffered overwhelming afflictions and felt abandoned by God, Job in chapter 23 had maintained his innocence. In fact, he had in the first 7 verses of Job 23 lamented if God would give him a hearing, he would maintain before the very throne of God that his troubles were greater than his sins. And yet, though he was wrongly accused by his friends, Job was confident, as you read verses 8 through 12 of chapter 23, he was confident that God knew he was a man of integrity, a man who desired to walk according to God's commandments. Now that brings us to chapter 24. Now, Job, accused of wrongdoing, the accusations brought against him by his friends had left him wondering why he suffered. Why did he suffer when the wicked prospered and went unpunished? Now, Job's reflections on the sins of the wicked you'll find recorded in Job 24 and verses 2 through 17. And I'm going to invite you to notice with me then, I would say the sins, the wickedness of the wicked. First of all, we have the tyrannical thieves that are noted. Now, Job first considered the company of the thieves, and then their wiles, deceptions, and effronteries against God and humanity. Now, remember, as you read verses 2 through 8, the setting was an agrarian society. The perspective was rural and agricultural. Of course, thievery and robbery are the same regardless of the culture or the generation. And though the coveted objects of the thief have changed, of course, with the culture. So times have changed, but we find that the nature of man is as wicked as ever. Well, before making an application to the 21st century society, let's consider Job's observations. Now, in verse 2, for instance, the first observation of Job was that thieves would remove landmarks, essentially physical stakes, maybe a stack of rocks or a tree or some other mode of marking a corner of a property. Well, a thief would remove those landmarks that really designated the boundaries of a family's lands. Well, not surprising, that same criminal activity continues in our day. There were thieves in Job's days who would not only move the landmarks and steal the property, but as we notice in verse 2, they would seize a neighbor's sheep, move them to graze in his pastures, thus robbing a man of his livelihood. Well, tragically, the wicked have always preyed upon the most vulnerable of a society, and we find in verses 3 through 8 the poor and the weak that are mentioned. In Job's day, an evil man would steal the donkey of an orphan, or in verse 3 again, demand a widow's ox for surety or collateral. Those wicked men would abuse the poor, mislead them. In verse 4, and in verses 5 through 8, leave the poor to forage for food and shelter as though they were wild beasts. Then notice verses 9 through 17, another class, if you would, of thieves. Now, these are the ones that were cruel oppressors of the weak and the defenseless. For instance, in verse 9, Job described children that had been taken from their mothers as collateral for debt. And tragically, the 21st century has revived this abuse with human trafficking and the mass movement of humanity across international borders. The wicked would take the robes of the poor, a symbol of the very bare necessities for life, as collateral for debt in verse 10. And such then is and has been the way of the wicked. While a farmer would reward an ox with grain he treads, the wicked would leave the poor destitute, hungry, and thirsty. And then we look at a third class. And it's interesting. Here we find the murderers and adulterers. The rise of violent crimes and murder in our day, the 21st century, is really akin to the observations of Job. He observed that murderers plotted and they preyed upon the poor and needy in verse 14. In verse 15, he numbered among the wicked the adulterers who disguised their faces to avoid recognition. Rounding out the society of the wicked, as you'll notice in verse 16 through 17, were those who were thieves, who marked houses in the day and enjoyed the guise of darkness and deceit to break into them and steal at night. Tragically, that's almost become epidemic in our day. And then notice in verses 18 through 25 what I would describe as the character and fate of the wicked. Now, we've considered the character and the sins of the wicked. Job agreed with his friends that the wicked will not go unpunished. The wicked are swift to steal the fruits of other men's labors because they are unwilling to toil in their own vineyards in verse 18. And nevertheless, Job's observation in verse 19 is that the wicked are akin to drought and heat and the snow. They will go the way of all sinners to the grave. That is, the wicked will have their reward. And then finally, Job 24 and verses 20 through 25. Now, describing the fate and the destiny of the wicked, Job graphically detailed the end of the wicked, writing in verse 20, "The womb shall forget him. The worm shall feed sweetly upon him." And that word for worm is really a maggot. "And he shall be no more remembered. And wickedness shall be broken as a tree." You know, I close with an observation: whether rich or poor, famous or infamous, powerful or weak, the bodies of the dead eventually become the diet of worms. And while the most stately of trees will eventually be broken and fall, the bodies of the powerful will inevitably decay in their graves. Now, we might wonder with Job, why is the Lord patient with the wicked and his pernicious ways? However, we are assured in verse 23, the eyes of the Lord are upon their ways. That is, the ways of the wicked. We read in Proverbs 15 and verse 3 the words of Solomon: "The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the wicked." You feel like there's no justice in the world and that sometimes things are unfair? Your observation, sadly, is true. But mark it down in the words of the great evangelist: there is a payday someday, and the wicked will not go unpunished. God bless you. Thank you for joining me for today's Heart of a Shepherd. Bye-bye.